Seems a bit strange to be sitting down when I give a talk. But I think I've been traveling for the last 3 weeks. I just got back from Japan on Sunday and then came here on Monday. So if my brain begins to wander, please excuse it. I'm a bit jet lagged still. But that's no excuse, of course. But I am very happy to be here, and it's a great honor to have an opportunity to talk at the conference. I was asked to talk about assessing language competences in school. Based on a talk I'd given, I have no idea when, maybe a few months ago. And I thought I would use some of the ideas from that talk and to think about what are the competences, how do we go about assessing them, and what are the problems, what are the issues that we're likely to engage in. I hope I upset a few people. I hope it makes people think a little bit about what we're actually doing and how we're doing it. If I don't succeed in doing that, I'll be a little bit disappointed. So, assessing language competences in schools. I'm going to talk about, Professor Martin said he was a bit concerned that he had only 20 minutes to give. Sorry, I thought this was a, hello? Is this working? No. I have a very bad reputation with technology. Once I go near technology, technology dies. It's working. Hallelujah. Anyway, if you missed the first bit, you didn't miss very much. It was only me talking about jet lag. Professor Martin was telling us he was worried that he only had 20 minutes to give a story that was 15 years long. Well, I'm far more ambitious than that. So I'm starting about 4,000 years ago. And in 20 minutes, I hope to get to the modern day, which would be hilarious, but we'll see how we get there. So I'm going to think about assessment and how did we get to where we are. I'm going to think about changes in general, in society, changes in language. And I'm going to think a little bit about assessment and change, and how assessment has dealt with change. Then I'm going to think a little bit about reading, just a couple of ideas, and focus in on one of our problems that we've got in relation to that area. And then throw in a final thought, as I want to do. So how did we get here? If we think about it, about 4,000 years ago, my ancestors were very busily carving the stone that you see on the left-hand side, the stone of Tyrol. By about 600 years later, we were sending missionaries around Europe to save people like yourselves who were entering the Dark Ages. Around the same time, though, some people in the Far East, in China as it happened, and these were the emperors in China at those times, had something else on their minds. We were trying to carve stones and save people. These guys were thinking about tests because they had realized that around that time that they had huge empires to run and nepotism wasn't such a great idea. It only got them so far, but at some point they actually had to put people in place who could do the job. I always like to amuse myself by saying to my British colleagues that they finally got to that idea about 1850. So they were a little bit behind the posse, but they got there eventually. And then they turned to people like the Irish and the Scots to run their empire. That's a bit of politics. The Chinese got into it in a big way about 600. So, quite a bit of time ago. And they had all of the trappings of modern exams. They had a certificate. That was the certificate. But only one person got it out from the whole of China. They had exam centers, and people would go and live in those little huts for 3 days while they took their exams. They ate, slept, were tested, sometimes died, and occasionally passed the test and went through 9 levels until they got to the stage where the emperor was himself testing them. There was one female emperor who upset everything, of course, as women do occasionally. And she started to ask them questions. And by my reckoning, that was the first oral exam. Modern education assessment started just over 100 years ago. What we know as the modern education measurement, which Thorndike introduced these first scales for scoring writing, which is a very interesting idea. I'm not going to go into it now, but I could talk forever about it. It's fantastically good stuff. Hiljegas then came up with an idea for using the same approach to testing compositions, which essentially was a whole load of compositions, each with a score. And you walked along the line and you compared your students' work and you said, right, it's closest to this one, it's a 7.2. Well, fantastic idea. We basically do the same thing today, but we wrap it up in science, but we're doing exactly the same thing. UCLs, as they were known at the time, Cambridge, were really the first people to bring us into the modern age with a relatively modern test, even by today's standards. It was horrendously long. I think it was, Nick will tell us, about 12 and a half hours. So they really believed in testing people properly then. None of this 40-minute tests. Hit them hard. But the first standardized test to emerge from the US was from Curtis, who basically put a lot of the other ideas together and come up with this notion of standardizing the way we would assess people and try to standardize the results that we would give to people as well. The big game changer was the multiple choice. That was the first question in the first multiple choice test, the Kansas test of silent reading by Kelly. I always like to think he had some sort of an Irish background, but he definitely came up with it. So I look on this as the first multiple choice item. But that was a game changer because that meant that people could take ideas from people like Galton and Thurston, who were developing psychometrics, and run with it. And in the US particularly, to this day, people run with this idea that you can assess people using multiple choice and using standardization and do it in a way that makes everything okay. In fact, there are lots of very well-known exams out there where there are no actual models of language proficiency or models of language progression that underpin the test. They're just underpinned by a mathematical scale. For me, it beggars belief that we still do it, but nothing should surprise us. Test validation theory has changed dramatically over the years as well. I always like to think about it. Cronbach and Meal, 1955, that was the year I was born. Language testing, I always think, modern language testing is as old as myself, which is a bit worrying. In those days, we thought about it as having three elements. Nowadays, of course, we've moved on dramatically. You can just about see that. That's a variation of the Weir and O'Sullivan model that we came up with. Cyril Weir and myself have a variation of his original model. But it takes into account the whole notion of the context of use, which is in that red box there, where we define the context of use in terms of the stakeholders. This brings us the whole notion of localization and the importance of the local in assessment, because in many cases, if you're trying to say things about a person in relation to a specific domain, and that group of people that you're talking about are all of that domain, well then you need some sort of a local element to your test. It's all wound up into this theory. So the theories that we've developed over the years have changed and grown dramatically. Other changes. Well, I'm not quite that old, but the classroom I would have gone to myself when I was a young fellow in the Christian Brothers School in Thurles in Tipperary would have looked not dramatically different to that. Nowadays, things are changing, sometimes dramatically. You know, I was just at the British Council School last night, for example, or the night before, and we were looking at their new computer lab, which is just frightening. You know, when you look at the kind of stuff that we had a mad lunatic Christian brother beating us around the room if we didn't learn our 7 causes of World War I, and you had to get them in the right order. And if you got them in the wrong order, you got a clatter. And I was silly enough to say that the war was started by the assassination in Sarajevo, and the Christian brother hit me on the head, and I knew I was right. He hit me on the head because it was Sarajevo to you, boy. Things have moved on quite a bit in classrooms since then. The way we learn has changed dramatically. You know, you look at young kids, it's frightening. You see, I have a niece who's got a little baby, what is it, year old or something. You give this little child a phone, and the child, a year old, will do this. You know, it's just crazy what kids are doing. They're progressing so quickly. And that's really important, because the way people are learning and the way people are interacting with the knowledge is changing dramatically before our eyes. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing about it? Society itself is changing. When I grew up in Ireland, we looked to the Irish Socialists, because my father was a nice, good Irish socialist. We also had the Tipperary Star, or the Irish Independent. We didn't read the press because that was a government paper. But we had the newspapers we turned to for our knowledge, for our information, and for our reading. We would meet friends at the corners and talk about other people, usually. We also, nowadays, though, we've moved on. We're looking at often the same things. The Tipperary Star, which is 130 years old or something, you now get an online version, which I do read occasionally, I have to admit. But we've moved on from our communications into the land of the web, which is really changing the way we communicate with each other. Like, I just spent a week in Japan, and my son-in-law built this WhatsApp group so that they could send photos and stuff around the place. And people are sending pictures and comments into Facebook, and I have no idea what's going on. It's all way above my head. But it's changing. Is assessment changing? This would be fairly close to the kind of test that the Christian Brothers would put us through. What has changed? The hairstyles, the clothes, the furniture. More or less nothing else. And that is worrying. When you think about all the other stuff that's changing, you think, well, what about assessment? It's not going very far, is it? You know, I'm sure you look at your exams and you're looking at that picture on the right. You're not looking at anything else. And it is something that we do need to think about. Why should we change? I've taken some data from a South African study looking at PISA results. And it demonstrates that the difference between the language, if you speak the language of the test at home, you have a 25% advantage over people who speak another language at home. Now, if you translate that into the way we learn and thinking about technology, if we learn primarily through technology and we communicate primarily through technology, surely people are at a disadvantage if we're not assessing the way they are learning. There has to be some connection between the two. So we really need to be thinking more of how technology can inform the way we assess. Now, we can either make the principled decision to abandon it and say, right, we're not getting involved, too difficult, too costly. We can partially include it, or we can try to create smart learning and assessment systems. Abandoning it is a little bit unlikely. We can't walk away. The door is open. We can't walk away from it. So it's not an option. Partially introducing it will help us to support current practices, it'll help us augment current practices, and it'll help us reduce teacher workload. That's the theory. The reality is that it makes teachers work way harder. And I've been looking at some new ideas where people have apps and teachers are supposed to identify particular competencies, and then every time a student in their class uses this competency, they hit a button. So there's no time to teach. You're constantly thinking about touching buttons and then making sure you upload it. And of course, then all the counting is done by the machine later. But have you had any time to actually interact with your students? I don't really think so. So I'm not rightly sure that that idea is going to really take off in a big way. Smart learning is a bit different, where we're trying to learn through play. And I think this notion of learning through play, learning through interactivity, with built-in assessment to the system, where we can, in a perfect world, at some utopia in the future, reduce or remove tests completely, that's sort of an ideal. To do that, we have to fully embrace technology. Whether that's realistic, I am not sure. We have to engage in its interdisciplinarity. If we don't, language testers, language people don't have the skills to do this on their own. we also have to introduce this notion of thought leadership. We have to drive it on. We don't even know where to start right now, but we have to find a way to do it. So if we're going to introduce smart learning and assessment, that's the challenge that is open to us. There are significant issues. What are the competencies? How can we assess them? Are our structures up to it? Let's think about reading. Many years ago, we would buy a book or a magazine. You'd see an Irish theme developing. I like to do that sort of thing. We might even buy the Irish Times. Or we might have a journal. People, academics like ourselves, might read a journal on Irish studies. If you're not into journals and you prefer manga, Japanese comics, I even found an Irish manga, believe it or not. So that is the traditional way that we approach reading. Manga is beginning to push the button a bit because there's not very much language in there. There's lots of photographs. Reading is changing, though. We've moved away from the newspaper. I personally use a Kindle a lot nowadays. But everybody else I know seems to read on their telephone, even novels. You know, I've seen people with their Kindle app on the phone reading their novels. So the way we're reading is changing. How we're reading is changing. This was a bit of a joke. 1974, an unsuccessful treatment of a case of writer's block. That was an actual paper published in 1974. As you can see, it's blank. The writer's block was never actually solved. But it was a joke. This is technically the shortest academic paper ever published. The shortest academic abstract ever published was a single word. It said no. But this is a bit of a joke, right? It's short, taking the mickey out of publishing in general. But the reality is that nowadays, if you look at online, and people can track how much time people spend looking at texts online, people read about 28% of the online content. So essentially, they don't scroll. I'm guilty of that. I actually have an edict with the people who work with me. If they send me a long email, I write them an email back and say, I don't scroll. So if you can't say it in a single window, it's not going to go in here, because I don't have time to read it all. I'm not going to read it all. But people these days, when they look at most online information, they're demonstrating about an 8-second attention span. If you don't grab their attention in 8 seconds, you've lost them. So the way people are interacting with texts is changing. Even in the academy, there is now a journal of brief ideas. Look at it online. It's really interesting. Every idea is 200 words. You're not allowed to take any more than 200 words to publish your idea. And their ideas come from all kinds of subjects. It's fascinating. There are also journals where there are very, very limited texts, where all of the data and the data analysis is presented as infographics. So the way, even in the academy, the way people are beginning to interact with reading text is changing dramatically. So what's the challenge in reading assessment? Before we thought of length, format, delivery channel, content, all the usual suspects. But now, when you think about the shortened attention span, the idea of what people read and how they read it, when we think about reading comprehension, what kind of comprehension are we thinking about? Are we thinking about full comprehension? Are we thinking about partial comprehension? And depending on the candidates, the context, the decisions that we're trying to make about these people, and the domain of use that we're interested in, we may have to accept that there is a continuum, that we're not always testing full comprehension, that we may have to accept that we have to test reading in other ways, and the decisions that we're going to make about a person are going to have to change to reflect the modern reality of what people read and how people read it. Of course, that goes against how we do it in assessment. The problem is that in our assessment systems, we generally have a system where we have a curriculum, a delivery system, and an assessment system, which are all linked. If they're not linked, the system is broken and it doesn't work. In this case, it's even worse, because the curriculum isn't asking the right question in the first place. It's not setting the right objectives. It's not identifying the right competencies. So it's broken before it starts. So we have to go back and think about that a little bit. A final thought then. If we think about the timeline of the last 170 years, essentially since people started to think systematically about competitive exams, particularly in Europe. The way we communicated with each other has been changing slowly and then faster and faster and faster, and we have no idea where it's going next. Because we have no idea how we're going to communicate with each other in the future, we have no idea where technology is going to take us in the future, I'm not quite sure we have any idea where assessment is going to take us in the future. Thank you very much.